Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Today, I'll be using a mix of historical context as a means of analyzing a poem from William Brewer's collection, I Know You're Kind, Oxiana, West Virginia. Specifically, I'm intrigued by how he juxtaposes individual experience with symbolic natural imagery, which in turn underscores an inextricable link between environment and self. Precisely, susceptibility towards addiction is compounded by how one's homeland is treated, especially when such exploitation is the result of outside influence. Now let's remember in the poem we're analyzing, right, Oxiana, West Virginia, that Oxiana is a nickname. The actual name of the town is Oceana, but in this introductory poem, I think Brewer intentionally chooses to refer to it as Oxiana, of course, as an homage to the Oxycontin drug epidemic. And this says a lot about the poem because we're, as readers, we're left for the question of, is this name, right, Oxiana, is that derived from what the residents of the region refer to themselves as, or has someone else placed this name on them? And I would beg to suggest the latter conclusion. As Brewer states in the poem, and as he starts his poem, none of it was ever ours, the Algonese. As an author writing about their home, Brewer's claim that Oceania never belonged to him is quite revealing. And I think that if we're really going to understand these authorial choices, we're going to require a little historical context. So, why did people begin settling in Appalachia in the first place? Well, I believe, taking a quote from Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, that there's a good explanation. And the colonial officialdom had found a way of alleviating the danger by monopolizing the good land of the eastern seaboard. They forced landless whites to move westward to the frontier, there to encounter the Indians and to be a buffer for the seaboard rich against Indian troubles, while becoming more dependent on the government for protection. Better to make war on the Indian, gain the support of the white, divert possible class conflict by turning poor whites against Indians for the security of the elite. Ultimately, this form of colonial pressure drove settlement towards the frontier at the time. In this case, that would be the Appalachian Mountains. Precisely, could be seen as a strategic play by colonial elite to further divide poor white class of Americans from indigenous populations. Even if both parties fell victim to a combined interest that would be the colonial elite, under this interest of land, such groups could be divided amongst one another. And as such, the region acted as a buffer from the colonial elite in the east to the rest of Western America. And the such implications of the modernist geography were that these communities, such as those that were originated in Oceania, had many years to develop their own sense of community and their own sense of pride in the land due to isolation. There's a direct link between the pride in the community and the geographic isolation of the region itself. I think it's reasonable why Brewer would incorporate so much imagery about the land he grew up in. After all, in a broader context, right, the history of displacement and exploitation of land has always been about the land itself. Whether this story concerns the displacement of the region's indigenous population, which was driven by pressures, as mentioned earlier, from the colonial elite, or the industrial exploitation of subsequent communities living in the region. And in the case of Brewer's poetry, my opinion is that this work primarily focuses on the exploitation under the lens of the coal industry, right? In Brewer's case, the most obvious way the land itself has led to subsequent exploitation of his community is through the industrialization of coal, which was significant during the peak of the second industrial revolution in America, lasting from around the late 1800s to early 1900s. And with this era, you got new technologies being developed at a rapid rate. And of course, for such technologies to exist, they all need one thing: fuel. So now Appalachia's geography is revisited, but this time in the lens of mineral rich coal deposits. And to gain access to the land, many stakeholders, with their complex legal vernacular, were able to maneuver their way into ceding the land deeds of the region. And as such, this has set a foundation for a town like Oceana to become a mining town. Brewer goes on to talk about this theme through his poetry. One line being, "And there was a light, a mile deep in the underworld mines, beaming from our foreheads." And in my opinion, the incorporation of this in quote suggests a sort of dependency on the mines themselves, right? Indeed, all people need the light of a sun above them to survive, but the suggestion that the light for Oceania is now a mile deep indicates a dependency on coal. And as such, if the coal were to disappear, I think there'd be dire consequences. But even so, I think it's important to talk about also the negative impacts of the coal industry and how it's based off a industry of exploitation. Coal mining is not the most sustainable practice, whether it is with the worker, right? Coal mining is labor intensive. There's risk for their health, mental health after being isolated miles underground. And of course, there's the unmanageable products of the practice itself, most notably coal slurry. Oftentimes, coal production leads to chemical spills that can negatively impact the residents of Oceania. And notable examples include the 2014 Elk River spill that ended up displacing around 300,000 West Virginians, or the 2010 Upper Big Branch disaster. And starting in the 1950s, coal extraction became increasingly more efficient with new technology, and different substitute energies began to replace it. And the consequence of this was that for a town like Oceana, which was so dependent on the mining industry, jobs became scarce. As such, poverty rates began to soar in these counties, and many were hesitant to leave because the communities were so tight knit. And ultimately, this exploitation and environmental devastation led to the mentality within the region, often dubbed Appalachian fatalism. Precisely this, the belief that after enduring so much, life is a phenomenon that is outside of the Appalachian residents' control. Thus, if something yields consequences for one future, such as drugs, it has less impact for a resident because there is this notion that life has already been determined by outside pressures. And this notion is not helped by outside perspectives of the region, as seen in documentaries such as Dancing Outlaws, The Wild and Wonderful Whites of West Virginia. Documentaries like these often reinforce a stereotype that rural West Virginia is full of uneducated white trash, which, when one takes a closer look, is obviously not true. These perceptions are, in fact, a result of external exploitation. And when one introduces drugs into the picture, this makes for a devastating combo. Opiates have always been tolerated within the mining industries because there's this rhetoric that you do what you must to keep working. Yet, I don't think anyone could have foreseen how devastating Purdue Pharma's 1996 drug, Oxycontin, could have been. Often labeled the poor man's heroin for how inexpensive it can be relative to other drugs. In a world plagued by Appalachian fatalism, residents flocked toward Oxycontin as a sense of relief. Not only did the drug offer relief, but from such a somber outlook on life, but it created an additional economy that could be substitute the need for working in the mines. And ultimately, I think that Oxycontin was an escape from the notion of this fatalism. But conversely, it's actually ended up making the population more dependent than ever before, in my opinion. One can justify these trends with statistics stating a rise in crime or overdose related deaths, but I believe Brewer captures this best. Where once was faith, there were sirens, red lights spinning door to door, a record 24. Whether these red light spinnings are referring to those of an ambulance attempting to pick up an overdose victim or the red lights of a mine shaft are unclear. But this ambiguity, in my opinion, is intentional. Brewer wants to show that addiction in Oceania is a product of outside exploitation. And since this outside exploitation has often involved the land, I think this is a big reason why Brewer has used so much natural energy. And most intriguing is that he compared it to a body. And in my opinion, describing the land this way is fascinating because as the land deteriorates, so do the bodies of those affected by the drug epidemic. Um, Examples include Nog Hill, where Massey Energy dumps cinder, the gray waste for teen breasts. The reader is left asking if the gray waste is that of a coal plant or that of an addict's tired breaths. Then there are poison trees, black like charred bones. Are the charred bones the wreckage of coal slurry spill or timber deforestation, or are they something more profound, the bones of an addict who was made unhealthy by Oxycontin? Furthermore, and this, I think this gets most of the point, the river, a vein of rust and trash. Have you ever seen so many cold faces slapped in the afternoon? Is the river vein of rust and trash a literal river, or is it the vein of an actual addict made full of rust and trash by how often one injects themselves with the drug? My belief is that Brewer has kept these statements ambiguous. Furthermore, either interpretation I think is deemed correct, because based on historical context in the region and the ambiguity of Brewer's poetry, the reader understands that people become addicts in Oceania as a result of external exploitation. And since Oceania has often been exploited for its land, the devastation of the region's environment fittingly parallels the devastation in the region due to drug addiction.